I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, still wearing my work heels, when he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I'm moving her in next week, so you'll need to clear out. Go stay with your folks or wherever." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't hear him, but because for a brief second, I genuinely thought he was joking. But the expression on Carter's face didn't flinch. Cold, flat, like he'd rehearsed it in his head 100 times. That morning, I had wired the final installment toward paying off his parents' six-figure debt. Money I worked for, money I saved, money I gave without ever being asked twice. Because I believed that's what family did. I believed in marriage, in loyalty, in building something together. And yet, there he stood, shoulders squared, already seeing me as nothing more than a piece of old furniture to be tossed out to make room for his new life. Behind him, I could hear quiet laughter from the hallway. His parents were there too. Of course they were. It wasn't just betrayal I felt, it was humiliation. Like I had been the last to realize I'd been cast in some cruel play where everyone else had already memorized their lines except me. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't sudden. This was planned. And what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that I had a plan too. My name is Elaine Bennett. I'm 52, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in finance, 27 years at a private advisory firm just outside of Denver, Colorado. I built my career from the ground up, starting as a junior associate fresh out of college and eventually rising to become the firm's senior client strategist, overseeing millions in portfolios and mentoring a generation of younger professionals who still call me Mrs. B with a kind of old-school respect I never take for granted. My days were long, my reputation solid, and while the work fulfilled me, my personal life never quite kept pace. I had one real relationship back in my early 30s, but it fizzled out under the weight of ambition and time. I told myself I was fine alone, and for years I was, until I wasn't. I met Carter at a mutual friend's retirement party. He was charming in the way that older men who know they're being watched often are, warm, polite, and just a little rough around the edges. He was my age, recently rebuilding his career, as he called it, after selling off a failed construction business that had apparently drained him dry. But he had this easy smile, this self-deprecating humor, and a way of making me feel seen, something I didn't realize I had been craving until it was given to me so freely. We started going to dinner together, always on my dime, though he'd pretend to reach for the check like it mattered. I overlooked it. I overlooked a lot, really. When he asked to move in after just 4 months of dating, citing rent costs and how good we were together, I said yes, because part of me wanted to believe in the kind of companionship I thought had passed me by. Carter's parents, Henry and Rose, came with him, emotionally at first, then literally. I met them about a month after Carter moved in, and they greeted me with the kind of over-the-top praise that felt rehearsed, like they'd memorized their lines too well. "I can't believe someone like you would end up with our Carter," Rose had said, squeezing my hand a little too tightly. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just awkward flattery. They asked about my job, how long I'd been with the firm, how much longer I planned to work, whether I had a pension, whether I owned the home outright. The questions came softly, wrapped in compliments, but there was a subtle intensity behind them, the kind that makes you realize too late that someone wasn't just making conversation, they were collecting data. I had no children of my own, no siblings nearby, and only distant cousins left in Kansas. My parents had passed within 2 years of each other during the pandemic, and with no real family to speak of, I suppose I made an easy target. At the time, though, I didn't see it. I just saw a man who made me smile again, who held my hand when I was tired and listened to me ramble about market trends like he actually cared. And when he brought up the idea of remodeling his parents' old bungalow so they could all move in together, a two-family setup just until they're more stable, I didn't object. I thought this is what people do when they love someone. They make space, they sacrifice. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't building a home. I was building a trap, One nail, one check, one compromise at a time. Not long after Carter and I settled into what I believed would be a shared future, he came to me one evening as I was reviewing some late client statements in the dining room. His voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant, as he slid into the chair across from me and said he had something on his mind, something about his parents. I set down my reading glasses, expecting a health concern, or maybe a small household favour, but instead he asked if we could move his parents in with us. "They're getting older," he explained, "and I just want to be there for them. Maybe we could renovate their place, make it more comfortable for everyone." I didn't hesitate. Of course I'd help. I told him that we could discuss the logistics, and that I was open to the idea of remodeling, maybe even turning the old house into a dual living setup. It sounded reasonable at first, even thoughtful, and when I saw the relief in his eyes, I took it as proof that I was doing the right thing. Looking back now, I understand that moment differently. It wasn't relief I saw, it was calculation. Within a week, we were discussing contractors and estimates. The figure wasn't small, close to $100,000, but I had the means, and I believed in investing in family, especially since Carter's parents had welcomed me so warmly. Even if their words sometimes carried a strange edge, I couldn't quite name at the time. Then, in the middle of reviewing floor plans one night, Carter sat down again, this time looking deeply uncomfortable, and confessed that his parents were in debt. Not just a little behind, not a few missed credit cards or unpaid bills, but a serious mounting debt that had grown to over $150,000. I remember sitting very still as he explained it, how it had started years ago with a bad business decision on his father's part, how medical expenses and poor choices had compounded it, how now the collectors were circling, and they were too ashamed to tell me earlier. He asked if I could help, not just with the renovations, but with the debt, all of it. I don't know what stunned me more, the size of the request or how easily it was made, as though it was simply one more line item in a shared life like groceries or a mortgage. But then Carter looked at me with such sorrow in his voice, saying he didn't know what else to do, that he loved me and trusted me, and that without my help, he might lose his family. And because I still believed those words meant something, because I still thought he was the man who held my hand at night and called me his second chance, I said yes. At first, I used what savings I had, transferring over $30,000 to cover the most urgent repayments. His parents came over to thank me, shaking my hand and calling me their guardian angel. His mother cried real tears, or at least they looked real, and his father promised they'd find a way to repay me somehow, someday. I wanted to believe them. The renovation began soon after. I coordinated everything, the permits, the payments, the materials. Carter helped pick out paint colours and offered opinions on lighting fixtures, but the financial burden, every cent of it, fell squarely on me. I handled it all while still working 60-hour weeks and quietly adjusting my own retirement timeline, telling myself this was temporary, that love sometimes required difficult choices. But as the weeks passed and the bills stacked higher, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Carter had stopped offering to split groceries. He declined to show me his pay stubs when I asked how much he could contribute toward the debt. He said his income barely covered his gas and phone bill. I offered to create a budget spreadsheet for us. He laughed and changed the subject. And yet, despite all that, I kept going. I told myself this is what it meant to be strong, to stand in the gap for people you love, even when they don't deserve it. I made payments each month like clockwork, even while cutting back on things I once enjoyed. My monthly massage, my favourite wine subscription, the little weekend getaways I used to take just to breathe. I worked, I paid, and I hoped. And each time I heard Carter say, "Thank you," or watched his mother hug me just a second too long, I tried to believe that it mattered, that they saw me not as a wallet, but as family. But deep down, a quiet voice had started to whisper, one I tried desperately to ignore. It asked, "What if you're the only one playing fair?" And one night, I would get my answer. It had been nearly a year since I began making regular payments toward the renovation and the debt. More than $70,000 out of pocket, not including the initial lump sum that had nearly drained my emergency fund. Still, I pressed on, convinced that this was the cost of love, of commitment, of holding a family together when no one else could or would. One Thursday evening, after an unusually smooth day at the office, I found myself finishing early and decided to surprise Carter with dinner. I had planned to pick up his favourite rosemary chicken from that little bistro near Centennial Park, the one we used to go to back when we still laughed without trying. I remember even feeling a flicker of warmth, that foolish hope that maybe all of this, my sacrifice, my loyalty, was beginning to mean something real again. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet, but I noticed something immediately. The old Buick Carter's parents drove was already parked out front. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the lights in the living room were low, and the front door was left slightly ajar, as if they had forgotten to close it behind them. I pushed it open gently, stepped inside, and that's when I heard it. Muffled voices, laughter, and the clink of ice in glasses. I paused just outside the archway leading to the den, my breath catching before I could even understand why. And then I heard my name. "Elaine's been better than we could have hoped for," Carter said, chuckling. "I mean, who just hands over that kind of money without even demanding receipts?" His mother chimed in with a snort. "She's got no kids, no real family. She needed someone to belong to. You did good, son. Real good." My father-in-law laughed next, his voice lower, more grating. "I told you when you met her. Go for it. A woman like that? Alone, successful, sentimental, easy." I stood frozen, the grocery bag still dangling from my fingers as their words landed one after another like hammers to my chest. They weren't reminiscing. They were gloating, reveling in how easily I'd been manipulated, how thoroughly I'd played the role they'd assigned me from the beginning. Carter kept talking. "She thinks this is forever. I'll keep playing house until the last dollar's paid, and then I'm done. She's useful, but let's be honest. I've already got someone lined up. Young, pretty, no lectures about savings or Roth IRAs. His mother burst out laughing again. "Don't dump Elaine just yet. Let her finish the job, then you can do whatever you want. But when the money runs dry, so should your patience." I had heard enough. I remember walking backwards toward the front door, each step measured, as though any sudden movement might make the entire house crumble around me. I didn't cry. Not yet. I didn't scream or confront them. Not then. I simply closed the door loudly enough for them to hear and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. The moment I entered the living room, all three of them turned to look at me with smiles so polished they made my skin crawl. "Elaine, you're home early," Carter said, walking over to take the bag from my hand, as if we were still some loving couple caught in the sweetness of routine. "Dinner smells amazing." His mother offered me a seat like nothing had happened. His father raised a glass and toasted me. To our rock, our angel. And I somehow sat. I smiled. I ate. I spoke softly and listened attentively. I played the role they thought I hadn't yet outgrown, because I knew that the moment I walked in, the game had changed. And they just didn't know it yet. That night, while Carter was in the shower humming the tune of a man who thought he had won, I locked myself in the study, opened a fresh notepad, and began to plan. Not revenge, not in the traditional sense, but restoration. Of my peace, of my power, of my name. Because what they didn't understand, what they never could, was that the woman they'd underestimated was not weak. She was waiting. The days that followed moved with the eerie calm of a storm gathering at sea, silent, dense, and heavy, with the knowledge that something would soon break. I went through the motions of my routine as though nothing had changed, preparing Carter's coffee just the way he liked it, responding to his mother's texts with carefully measured warmth, and maintaining the exact tone of a woman still willing to carry their burdens without hesitation. But inside, everything had shifted. Each moment of false affection, every overly rehearsed smile they threw my way, only solidified my decision to stop playing the fool they thought I was. I knew now that what I'd been living wasn't marriage. It was a long con, and I was the final investor expected to fund the ending. What they didn't know was that I had already begun pulling the strings quietly, intentionally, and with the same patience I had once reserved for managing multi-million-dollar accounts. I started by contacting my attorney, a woman named Deborah Pierce, whom I had known professionally for over a decade. She had handled estate transitions for several of my high-net clients, and I trusted her discretion as much as I trusted her competence. Without revealing too much over the phone, I scheduled a meeting under the guise of updating my will. In person, I laid out everything: the debt, the property renovations, the forged family dynamic, and most importantly, the conversation I had overheard. Deborah didn't blink. She simply nodded and began outlining my options. Within the next few weeks, I moved the remaining renovation payments into a separate account under my sole name. I arranged for the title of the newly remodeled house to be transferred, quietly, legally, and without raising any suspicion, to reflect me as the primary and only owner. Since I had funded the remodel in full and Carter's name had never been officially added to the deed, the process was clean and fast. I also halted further debt payments, calculating that I had covered enough of their liability to justify restitution when the time came. Let the wolves come knocking again. They could knock on someone else's door this time. I didn't stop there. I began documenting everything: bank transfers, email exchanges, texts where Carter referred to me as handling things or taking care of the bills. Every piece of evidence was saved in both physical and digital form, carefully stored under innocuous file names and backed up in multiple places. I wasn't just preparing for a divorce. I was building a firewall so complete that they wouldn't even see it coming until the gavel fell. At night, when the house settled and the lights dimmed, I lay awake not from sadness but from focus. I thought about every holiday I had spent at that table listening to Henry ramble about his old money days while I refilled his wine glass, every time Rose cried about late payments while I offered reassurance and wrote another check, and every moment Carter had slipped into bed beside me, lying not just with his body but with every breath, every word, every plan. And yet, through it all, I remained calm. I smiled when Carter casually mentioned how grateful he was that we were almost done with everything. I nodded when Rose spoke about how relieved she was that the debt collectors had stopped calling. I even played along when Henry joked that once the last bill was paid, they might finally retire in peace. I played the role perfectly because I understood now that revenge, when wielded right, didn't require rage. It only required clarity and time. So I waited. I let Carter believe he had won, that he had successfully milked me for every last cent while warming up his replacement behind the scenes. I let Rose believe that her tears had bought her freedom. I let Henry believe that his past debts had been forgiven by the kindness of a gullible woman too lonely to say no. But I wasn't lonely. I was watching, and every second I stayed was one step closer to the moment when everything they'd built on my back would fall apart. Not with a scream, but with a signature. 3 months after I began setting my plan into motion, Carter came to me with a peculiar expression, part serious, part rehearsed, as though he'd been practicing his lines in the mirror, waiting for the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow. We were in the kitchen. I was rinsing vegetables under the soft glow of the overhead light when he cleared his throat and said, "Elaine, I think it's time we talk about us." I didn't turn off the faucet right away. I let the water run just a moment longer than necessary, then shut it, wiped my hands slowly, and faced him. He didn't hesitate. "I've met someone else," he said plainly, as though this was a business transaction and not the dismantling of a marriage. "Her name's Renee. I'm moving her in, and I think it's best if you leave, go stay with your relatives or something, We'll sort the paperwork afterward. I blinked, not out of confusion, but to hide the calm fire that had been smouldering just behind my eyes for weeks. I asked him very gently what exactly he meant by moving her in, and whether he thought it was appropriate to give me orders about a house he didn't own. He smirked. I figured you wouldn't take this well, he said, glancing toward the hallway where I could already hear his parents approaching, likely having waited for the right moment to join in. But look, he continued, and we can work something out. You can stay maybe if you help with the chores or cover rent for a bit. I mean, Renee won't mind. She's chill. It was almost impressive, the depth of his delusion. By the time Henry and Rose stepped into the room, Carter had fully shifted into performance mode, arms folded, voice steadied, posture smug. His mother chimed in, offering a faux sweet suggestion that I could earn my keep by cleaning and helping around the house, since I was so used to doing everything anyway. His father chuckled and mentioned, not so subtly, that there's no such thing as a free ride. That was the moment I drew the line. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with truth, clear and precise. No, I said, my voice calm enough to chill the room. You'll be the ones leaving. Carter's brow furrowed and he laughed nervously. Elaine, let's not be dramatic. You don't even own the place. I reached into the drawer by the fridge where I kept our household documents, pulled out the file folder with the deed, and handed it to him without a word. He flipped through the pages quickly at first, then slowly, as recognition crept over his face like cold water down his spine. His parents leaned in to look, and the silence that followed was the kind that confirms every unspoken fear. You see, I said quietly, I never added your name. I paid for the renovations, I paid off your debt, well, most of it, and I filed the property under my trust months ago. You're not on anything. Legally, this house is mine. So if we're talking about leaving, then I'm afraid the three of you will have to find somewhere else. Rose paled first, then Henry sat down without speaking. Carter tried to recover, offering a weak protest that I had agreed to take on their debt and that surely I wasn't just going to leave them homeless. We're family, he insisted, though the word rang hollow now. You took advantage of my kindness, I said, no longer soft. You schemed with your parents, used me, lied to my face, and made me believe I was part of something real. That wasn't family. That was fraud. He opened his mouth to reply, but I raised a hand. And just to be clear, I added, I never finished paying the full debt. I paused the final $90,000 weeks ago. You'll be hearing from the collectors soon, and from my lawyer. I've already filed for divorce. And yes, Carter, there will be alimony and damages. He turned to his parents in shock, but they had nothing to offer him now. I watched as the weight of what I'd done began to settle across their faces, not just the legal consequences, but the sudden realization that their safety net had been cut, cleanly and without warning. I trusted you, I said, not because I wanted to guilt them, but because it was true. And you saw that as weakness. But I'm not weak. I'm done. And with that, I walked out. Not because I was running away, but because I had already won. The house was mine. My dignity was intact. And the people who once saw me as their lifeline were finally left to sink in the mess they'd created. In the weeks that followed, the house felt quieter. Not empty, not lonely, just calm. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from peace finally reclaiming the space it was denied. Carter moved out within days of the legal filing, his parents not far behind, forced to confront debts that were no longer mine to carry, and a reality they could no longer manipulate to their liking. I didn't look back when they left, and I didn't wait for apologies that would never come. I had already given too much to people who only ever knew how to take. Once the divorce was finalized and the settlement approved, I sold the house. It was a hard decision at first. After all, I had put not just money but pieces of my hope into those walls. But it was never truly home, only a symbol of what I had once believed I was building with someone who never intended to stay. The buyer, a young family from Durango, offered more than asking, and the sale went through smoothly. I walked away not only debt-free but with a modest gain, $40,000 after all legal fees and outstanding balances were cleared. Beyond the financial relief, there was something more valuable I regained: my clarity, my boundaries, and the simple but powerful understanding that love is not proven by sacrifice alone. I had given Carter every chance to be decent, to build something worthy, and when he chose betrayal, I chose myself. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in quiet, unwavering truth. The alimony payments came as expected. Deborah, my attorney, also filed civil claims against both Carter and the woman he had moved in behind my back, citing emotional distress and financial manipulation. And while the monetary outcome wasn't extravagant, it was enough to affirm that the law still had room for women like me, women who had given too much for too long and finally drew a line. With the last of the documents signed and filed, I took a trip I had postponed for nearly a decade. I spent 3 weeks in Maine, walking the rocky coastlines, eating alone without shame, and watching the sunrise from the deck of a small rental cottage that smelled faintly of cedar and salt. I brought nothing with me from that old life, not his shirts, not the photo frames, not even the coffee mugs that once said his and hers. I brought only myself, and for the first time in years that was more than enough. People sometimes ask me now, especially those who know bits and pieces of what happened, whether I regret anything, whether I would go back and undo it all if given the chance. And the truth is, I wouldn't. Because the version of me who stayed too long, who gave too much, who believed too blindly, that woman was doing her best with what she knew. And the woman I am today stands on her shoulders, wiser not because of what I lost, but because of what I refuse to lose any longer: my worth. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel small in your own home, if you've ever handed over your time, your money, or your heart to someone who mistook your kindness for weakness, I hope you hear this and remember your story isn't over just because someone else tried to write your ending. Mine didn't end in bitterness. It ended in truth. And it began again in freedom. If this story spoke to something inside you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that no matter how deep the betrayal, there is always a way back to yourself.